Hi there, this is Lionel Windsor at Moore Theological College, and I'm talking to you today about Romans chapter 16. I'd love to talk about Romans 16. I wonder when you last heard a sermon on Romans chapter 16. I'm not sure if you've heard or been part of any kind of teaching or Bible study series on Romans. And I wonder if you've sort of got to the end of Romans chapter 15 and then gone, Romans chapter 16, that's just a list of names. Nothing particularly interesting there, not worthy of a sermon or a Bible study or anything like that. Let's just move on. One of the reasons that I want to talk about Romans chapter 16 is because I've just had an article published in the Bulletin for Biblical Research, and that article, I look at Romans chapter 16. The article is called, I'll just read it out, the title, Junia, Missionary Partnership and Honour, the Discourse Function of Romans chapter 16, verse 7. Now, I think the article itself is probably behind a paywall because people who put journals together work very hard and need to be paid. But I'm not going to be reading that article out to you right now. I just want to talk to you about Romans chapter 16. One of the reasons I want to do that is that today, in fact, and this is entirely coincidentally, we said farewell here from Moore Theological College, from the faculty, to Jane Tooher. Jane Tooher has been a faculty member for the last 15 years. She has a heart for gospel ministry, and she's moving from the faculty to be involved in church ministry close by, so we'll still be able to see her. But we said farewell to her. Jane has been a valuable member of the faculty here and has actually been involved and spearheaded the Priscilla and Aquila Centre, which is a centre that runs conferences, provides resources, does a whole lot of other things to promote the ministry of women in partnership with men. Jane has been a great inspiration and benefit to me, and Jane is actually part of the story of this article. Maybe 3 years ago, perhaps 4 years ago, Jane, and this is probably longer than this, Jane has done analysis of different sermon series in Romans and has really looked to see how often the people actually preach on Romans chapter 16. And she looked at it, and she looked online, and she looked at different series, and she found, well, not very often. And she issued that as a bit of a challenge to us. We were teaching New Testament, we were teaching Romans in third year, and we had a look, and we didn't have a lecture on Romans 16 either. We'd included Romans 16 in other lectures. So I thought, well, I'll write a lecture on Romans chapter 16. Not only did I write a lecture on Romans chapter 16, but I thought, well, I'll give a paper, an academic paper at the Priscilla and Aquila conference, promoting the ministry of women in partnership with men, looking at Romans chapter 16, and focusing particularly on Junia, who's a particular figure in Romans chapter 16, verse 7. I gave that paper. That paper turned into writing up an academic article. I submitted that academic article to the Bulletin for Biblical Research. And another quite random piece of the story is that just before I'd done a lot of the work, just before I was due to write it up, I was a pedestrian in a pedestrian and car accident. I broke 7 ribs, so I actually wrote up this article while I had some broken ribs and had some painkillers, but it looks like they accepted the article, and looking back on it without any painkillers now, it seems to pass muster and be okay. Anyway, what I wanted to do is not so much read that article out to you, but help you to see how valuable it is to look in depth at Romans chapter 16. But I do want to share with you some of the findings of the article, not in the article's written in a more academic tone. I want to just share that with you in a little bit less of an academic tone. I've got some notes up here just next to me, and I wanted to help you to see why should we preach on, teach on, have Bible studies on, etc., Romans chapter 16, and how do you do it? What is valuable in Romans chapter 16? Why does it matter, and what can you derive and see in Romans chapter 16? Now, my particular article focused especially on the figure of Junia, and the reason for that is because there's been so much scholarly attention paid to Junia. There have been books and articles written so much over the last 20 to 30 years. So That's what I focused on, but I didn't want to just focus on Junia. I actually wanted to look at how does this help us to understand Romans chapter 16 and indeed Romans chapter 16's place in the rest of Romans in particular. So Romans chapter 16 verse 7, what does it say? This is my translation, but it's a pretty regular translation. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsfolk and my fellow prisoners, who are notable among the apostles and who came to be in Christ before me. That's Romans chapter 16 verse 7. Now, interestingly, that previously, when I say previously, I'm thinking the last few hundred years in English-speaking scholarship and maybe the last 300 or 400 years in German-speaking scholarship, there's been a more widespread consensus that when Paul mentioned Andronicus and this other person, he was actually referring to a man, Junius, not Junia. And the reason for that has got to do with Greek and with accents and with textual criticism and various other things. There have been books written about it. Some called Epp and others have looked in a lot of detail there. But that was particularly challenged, that view, in 1977 by a Catholic scholar, Bernadette Bruton, her particular interest was in the ordination of women to the priesthood in the Catholic Church. And so in her mind, issues of authority and leadership and all those kinds of things that are modern concerns were at the fore. But she did some work, and then further people have followed up on that to say that actually, no, it's far more likely that Paul is talking here about a woman, Junia. And so as a result, there have been these questions in scholarship, and scholars have asked these questions like, firstly, was Junia a woman or a man? And I think there's been a move towards the acceptance that it is Junia is a woman, and that was actually the understanding of most commentators in the early church and the medieval period as well. And if she is a woman, there's another question: was she an apostle? So there's a question of what that means, among the apostles. Was she among the apostles, or was she well known to the apostles? Because that's a way that can be read or has been read by some people. If she is an apostle, people have asked the question, well, what was the nature of her authority and her role? What did she do? What does it actually mean if she was an apostle? What was she actually doing? And it's been harder to answer that one because you don't necessarily have the text there in front of you, but people have asked those questions or sometimes assumed the answer to those questions. But there's actually other questions that are normally not asked in scholarship. The questions I was interested in were, well, okay, how does this all fit in to the overall argument of Romans? What's Paul doing here? What's he trying to say? What's he trying to bring out by giving this greeting to Andronicus and Junia? And one of the very interesting issues is that there's a plurality there. What I mean, there's among the apostles. We've got these apostles, plural. Why plural? Why does it matter? And the reason that I'm interested in that and that people haven't spoken so much about it is because scholars have tended to be far more interested in Junia's individuality. Let's focus on her as an individual, as a character. So they think, and envisage her as an apostle doing, an apostolic thing, normally without reference to the other apostles. So I was interested in that question of plurality, but also, what's Paul doing here? How does it fit into the overall argument of Romans, which is an incredible book about the gospel, a credible letter about the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and the preaching of the gospel. So that was the interest in my article. So my questions were, why does Paul choose to describe Junia and Andronicus in precisely the way he does? And another question, what's the significance of the plurality of the term apostles? It was interesting that a lot of the articles that are written actually just use a singular, was Junia an apostle? Or even sometimes when they quote earlier commentators like John Chrysostom, they'll quote John Chrysostom, who actually talks about plurality. He says Junia was among the apostles, but they translate it with a singular, as if Chrysostom is saying that Junia was an apostle. So that's fascinating. How does Paul's description of Junia contribute to his broader strategy? What's he trying to achieve in the letter? As you can see in Romans 16, how does it fit into what Paul's seeking to do in Romans 16? And how does it fit into what Paul's seeking to do in Romans overall? So I didn't want to ignore all the historical questions surrounding Junia's identity and role, but I was also very interested in particularly what's going on in Romans. And I wanted to understand and enrich the understanding of that verse, but also the chapter, Romans 16, in light of Romans as a whole. So let's think about Romans chapter 16 then. What's Romans chapter 16 about? And if you're thinking of, if you're preaching on Romans, doing Bible studies in Romans, you feel like you really want to understand what's going on in Romans 16. Well, there's some really, really fascinating and helpful things that are going on in Romans chapter 16. Now, there's a whole lot of greetings. So when you read it, your eyes can glaze over. List of names. What do you do with that? Let's not bother. But look at those list of names. What's Paul doing there? He's strengthening bonds of love and affection and honor as well. What he's really doing there, there's this whole honor and a little bit of shaming as well later in the chapter, but mostly honor going on. He's honoring people. He's enhancing the honor of individuals as he singles them out and he honors them. And it also helps Paul to make those connections to enhance his own apostleship, because he hasn't met these people actually in Rome. Well, some of them he has met, but most of the people he hasn't, and he wants to sort of set out his own apostleship there and strengthen that, because he's actually wanting to preach the gospel in Rome. So the big question is, what's the significance of Romans chapter 16 for Paul's apostleship, for his mission, for his apostleship to the nations? And that often isn't very often explored in these, especially when people ask about Junia as an apostle. So my two big points about Romans chapter 16 are, when you read Romans chapter 16, there's a whole lot of missionary partnership going on. Paul's involved in partnership. He's not a sole trader. He's in partnership in the mission. And there's all these dynamics of honor going on. He wants to honor people. So if you've got Romans 16, it'd be really helpful for you to have it open in front of you and just have a look at it. Open it up in the Bible and have it open in front of you. So how does Paul talk about missionary partnership in Romans 16? How does he enhance missionary partnership? How does he affirm partnership in ministry and especially in mission? Well, there's a whole lot of, he talks about other churches within the orbit of his mission. So Phoebe, she's what's called a diakonos. What's that, an emissary, a deacon, hard to tell, of a church in Cenchrea. Prisca and Aquila, Prisca's another name for Priscilla, they're involved with all the churches of the Gentiles. Epanetus, he was the first fruits of Asia for Christ. Greetings from all the churches of Christ. Paul's doing a lot to bring various churches within the orbit of his mission and the mission that they're engaged in. And then he also describes individuals in Rome, very similarly to the way he describes a little bit later on in the chapter, individuals in his own missionary team. So he starts by talking about people like Prisca, Aquila, Urbanus in Rome. And he also talks about Timothy, who's with Paul, and their fellow workers. Prisca and Aquila in Rome, as well as Gaius, who's with Paul, they're hosts of a church. Probably Gaius is host of a church. The believers in Rome, they were to receive Phoebe. Gaius is a host for Paul, so there's all these connections of hospitality going on. Andronicus, Junia, and Herodion in Rome are like Lucius, Jason, associated with Paul. Paul calls them, calling that kinsfolk, or basically relatives, not relatives, fellow Jews, basically, people who are fellow Jews with him. And also Paul mentions that Prisca and Aquila had formerly worked alongside Paul, as well as, and we'll come to it, Andronicus and Junia, it seems, probably. So there's all these mutual greetings, and what that does is it strengthens missionary partnership. Missionary partnership's really key. But also, there's a lot of honouring going on in Romans chapter 16. Someone has said Romans chapter 16 reads like an honour roll. So what does Paul do to honour people? Well, firstly, he talks about people who are first or prominent in response to his mission. Epanetus is, he calls him the first fruits for Asia, first fruits of Asia for Christ. Andronicus and Junia, verse 7, came to be in Christ before me. Phoebe, verse 2, had been a benefactor of many and of myself. And in fact, even the word benefactor kind of has the idea of being first to give in there. Priscilla, Aquila, and Gaius, they were hosts of churches. Andronicus and Junia, he calls them this word, which in Greek is episemoi, notable among the apostles. We'll talk about that in a minute. And there's others as well. Paul particularly honours people who are committed to the mission, to difficult labour or danger in the mission. Mary and Persis, he says, they've laboured greatly. And there's a word, the word labour actually means toil, tiring exertion, sweaty labour, really hard work. Tryphena and Tryphosa, he calls them labourers in the Lord. Prisca and Aquila, he says, they risk their own necks for my life. And then again, Andronicus and Junia, Paul calls them fellow captives. By contrast, just to note in verses 17 to 20, Paul actually warns against opponents of the apostolic mission, and there he seeks to use shaming terminology to do that. He's not being underhanded there, he's just saying, what they're doing is shameful. He wants to distance them from the community, but he really wants to honour all these people involved in his mission. But when it comes to honour, and this is really important, Paul's standards of honour, the norms he used, the standards he used to honour people, are often the opposite to the typical kinds of standards of honour that you'd find in regular Roman society of the time, and in fact, in our own society very often. And there are two particular categories that in Roman society typically were not honoured, but are specially honoured by Paul. And it seems that Paul goes out of his way a little bit to do that. The first are Jewish believers. So Andronicus and Junia and Herodian, Lucius, Jason, Sosipater, he points out deliberately, they are my kinsfolk, my fellow Jews, basically. Verse 7, verse 11, verse 21. Also, we know from other places, Priscilla and Aquila and Timothy were Jewish, although Paul doesn't go out of his way to name them that. So that's one category, Jewish believers. And in Rome, we have very good reason to believe that Jewish people were not particularly honoured. They lived on the opposite side of the Tiber River. They would not have been honoured in the Roman capital. And the second category is women. So it's really interesting in Romans, as opposed to, say, 1 Corinthians, where he also lists people. But in Romans, he seems to be doing this a little bit more deliberately. He mentions 9 women and 17 men in Rome, but his specific praise for active labours connected to the mission is more frequently given to women. So he specifically singles out more often women like, here we go, Prisca, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, and probably Rufus's mother as well. So missionary partnership and honour are especially important in Romans chapter 16, but Paul's standards of honour focused on the mission, and especially we see are different to typical Roman standards of honour. And Paul seems to be going out of his way to do that. Okay, now let's just zoom out to think about all of Romans just for a second. The big theme of Romans is the gospel. The gospel is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. Now, the thing about the gospel in Romans is that it comes through Jesus Christ. It's a message about Jesus Christ, but it's not just a message. It's a preached message. It's a proclaimed message. It's a message that those are sent to proclaim. So Romans tells us two things, actually. It doesn't just tell us about the content of the gospel, which it does. Romans also really helpfully tells us about the preaching of the gospel. It gives us a lot about ministry and mission. So if you're doing a preaching program in Romans or a teaching program in Bible study or anything like that, and you're only focusing on the content and not thinking about all the things that Paul says about ministry and mission, I think you're missing out in a big way. Paul's mission and the Romans, what's going on here? In the letter, Paul's writing Romans to share the gospel with them, to talk about probably misconstruals of the gospel, to help them to understand that gospel of Jesus' salvation through faith in him. And Paul also wants their help as well. He wants to join in missionary partnership with them. He wants their help to take it further to Spain. So the people in Rome that he writes to, they're beneficiaries of the gospel. They've heard the gospel. They've come to trust in Jesus, to be rescued from their sin and judgment through Jesus' death on the cross, all those things. That's really important in Romans. Paul sees them as beneficiaries of the gospel, but also as partners in the gospel as well, together. So he wants to strengthen both of those elements. And he says that back in chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. That's why Paul, in Romans, highlights quite a lot his own missionary activity, especially in the beginning and the end. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 15, 1 to 17, you could say, and chapter 15, verse 14 and onwards and into chapter 16. He's highlighting his own missionary activity. He also does it in chapters 9 to 11 as well. And he also talks about his gospel as a Jew-Gentile dynamic. It's coming from Israel to the nations. It's going from Jew first to also to the Greek. That's how the mission works in Romans, as he talks about it. So there's a priority for Jews, not a priority, in every way, but there's a priority at least, and especially in terms of honour, prominence. Paul says the Jew first. So that's what's going on in terms of the preaching of the gospel. And also, really interestingly, in Romans, Paul goes out of his way to talk about his apostleship, being an apostle, and the preaching of the gospel more generally, in plural terms. Things that are marked, unexpected, things that you wouldn't expect, but that Paul seems to go out of his way to do. When he talks about apostleship, it's plural. So, chapter 1, verse 5, he talks about he's an apostle, and then he says, we, plural, have received grace and apostleship for the obedience of faith among all the nations. Chapter 1, verse, that's unexpected. Why would you say we? Why not I? Chapter 10, verse 8, he's been talking about himself as an apostle, and then he says in chapter 10, verse 8, the word of faith that we proclaim. We, plural. He didn't have to say that. Chapter 10, verse 15, really interestingly, he quotes Isaiah, but it looks like he changes, and he quotes Isaiah, who's talking about people who preach and who are sent, i.e., sort of apostles, but he seems to actually change the quote from Isaiah to take something that's singular and make it plural. So in Isaiah, Isaiah says, how beautiful on the mountains of of the one who preaches the good news. Paul changes that. How beautiful on the mountains of the ones, plural, are the feet of the ones, plural, who preach the good news. So he's changed it. It's marked, it's prominent. There's plurality to apostleship. He's doing this together with other people. So who's Paul talking about when he uses the plural? Some people say he's talking about the other, apostles like Peter, whatever. I don't think so. He doesn't mention Peter yet in Romans. I think he's talking about others who are involved with him in his ministry team, and also he's setting up for and doing what he does in chapter 16, which is he's saying, and chapter 15, and also he's already said in chapter 1, I want to be involved with you in this apostolic mission. So there are partners in the apostolic mission. There are apostles. Missionary partnership is especially prominent in the bit that's just before chapter 16. Paul seeks to draw those in Rome into the orbit of his mission in that Jew-Gentile dynamic. He wants them to help him on his way, which means practically helping him, giving him the support that he needs, being partners with him. We see that in chapter 15, verse 24, as he goes on to Spain. And then just before chapter 16, he talks about, I want to contend together with you. I want to get refreshment together with you. I want to share with you in this mission that I am doing. So that's true, partnership. Also in Romans, there's honor. But he talks about honor, and he talks about it in several prominent ways. But the thing about honor is that the gospel that he proclaims reverses typical human understandings of what is honourable. So, his very first, the theme statement of Romans, chapter 1, verse 16, begins, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Got reason to be ashamed because it doesn't seem honourable in Roman society. But he says, I am not ashamed of it, even though people think that perhaps he should be ashamed of it. He also uses the term boasting a lot. The term boasting, it doesn't, in English, that seems to come across as a negative thing. It's not necessarily negative. It's the idea of expressing pride in, being proud of something. And that can be negative, but it's not always. So he talks about some things that in Roman or in Jewish society might be seen as things that you would want to boast in. And he says, no, we don't boast in these things. He talks about a Jewish person who boasts in his law teaching. And he says, he's got no praise, he's got no honour from God. Chapter 2, verses 17 to 29. He also talks about boasting being excluded in works, because we don't boast in our works because we trust in Jesus instead. But we do have a new boast. There is something we boast in. Chapter 5, verses 2 and 11, we boast in the hope of God's glory. We boast in God's vindication. We look forward to the future. And that's why he says in chapter 5, verse 3, we boast in being oppressed. We actually boast in sufferings, which is a really strange thing, to be oppressed, to suffer, but to suffer for the sake of the gospel. But that's what he honours. That's what he takes pride in. And that's because of the gospel, because he also says in chapter 15, verse 17, I have a boast in my mission, my own gospel mission. Why? Because his mission is being driven by the gospel, and the message of the gospel turns around those categories and makes us look forward to God's vindication and to suffer now and to enable us to suffer for the sake of preaching the gospel. And that is something that we can boast in, that is actually honoured. And it wasn't honoured in human society. Why is that relevant to chapter 16? Why is it especially relevant to Andronicus and Junia? Well, let me read it again and see how, I'll just read it, chapter 16, verse 7, and listen to how all those themes are being applied by Paul in this verse. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsfolk, Jewish, and my fellow prisoners, who are notable among the apostles and who came to be in Christ before me. Okay, there's a lot of honouring going on, and it's all in relation to those things that we've seen in Romans. So I just want to sort of quickly go over some of the things that previous scholars have asked, some questions previous scholars have asked. One question is, was Junia a woman? And I've already talked about that. Yes, I think she was. I don't think it was Junius. Was Junia among the apostles? Or was she just well known to the apostles? Well, some people have said, oh no, what that means is well known to the apostles. And so in my article, I go into a great deal of detail. I don't go into a great deal of detail. I've gone into a great deal of detail. Other people have done that as well. But I look at that question, and I looked at the Greek manuscripts that various people have talked about, have referred to. And I've really concluded that, no, I really do think she was among the apostles. I don't think the idea of being well known to the apostles really does hold water. I checked out the Greek manuscripts that people who have that view point to, and I don't think the manuscripts generally actually back that up. So that's what I think. Info's there in the article. But also, it actually fits in with what Paul has said so far in Romans, that Junia was among the apostles, as was Andronicus. Why? Paul has highlighted his own missionary activity as an apostle. He presents his missionary activity as a Jew-Gentile dynamic with a sense of Jewish priority in the mission, Jew first, also the Greek. Andronicus and Junia, he highlights them as Jewish, his own kinsfolk. And they're highlighted also as those who came to be in Christ before me. They're sort of even more, likely to be Jewish there. He also emphasises apostolic plurality and partnership. We've seen that all the way through. And Andronicus and Junia, he doesn't just say an apostle. He says together they are among the plural apostles. And Paul, as he talks about gospel ministry and mission, applies those categories of honour informed by God's grace, by the gospel, by looking forward to those end times when God will vindicate us. And so suffering for the gospel is honoured. Apostolic suffering for the gospel is honoured. We see that in Romans. Those who might otherwise be disregarded are honoured. And so Paul honours them in those terms, that they've suffered, Andronicus and Junia, for the gospel as fellow captives. And the word implies shamed, conquered peoples. That would have been shameful in Rome. And also Jews, one of them's a woman. there's all sorts of reasons why in Rome these people would not have been honoured, and Paul points out they've suffered by being captives. The Romans don't like them. Now, exactly what that was, probably an imprisonment alongside Paul. But Paul doesn't just say imprisoned. He says captives, a shameful term, but an honourable term in the gospel terms. Okay, so I'm going to ask another question. Who were the apostles? You actually have to ask that question. Who were they? Now, this is where we need to be really careful. The word apostle means sent one, and there's two sort of connotations to that. That is, when you think about the word apostle, you're thinking a little bit about, or a lot about mission. That's one category. Mission, the apostle travels. An apostle is someone who travels, who's a missionary, who speaks a message. And also there's a sense of authority there, because normally when you think of an apostle's sent by somebody, and so they've got the authority of the person who's sending them, or they carry that authority. So my question is, which is more prominent in this reference? Because sometimes one can be more prominent, mission, other times the other can be more prominent, authority. Which one's more prominent in this reference? Mission or authority, or both? Well, here's some unlikely options for what Paul means when he says apostles. I don't think he's saying they're just messengers of a church. That's where mission is really prominent, but authority is not prominent at all, very much. Because if they were messengers of churches, Paul would have made it clearer. He would have said, the messenger of this church. I don't think, though, on the other pole, that they're defined authoritative community leaders like the 12. That would be where we're thinking a lot about authority and not very much about mission. Now, that's unlikely because Paul isn't trying to enforce his authority in Romans. And so in Galatians, maybe, but here he's not. This is about partnership. So I don't think he's saying, among the apostles means among, the people that everyone thinks of having high authority, Peter and perhaps James. Perhaps missionaries or evangelists in general. Some people have said, prominent among missionaries. Maybe Andronicus and Junia are just missionaries. But I don't think so, because he says the apostles, not just apostles, but the apostles. Now, I think he's talking about a defined group of people. So I think the most likely option is, there's one more option that I'll just mention that I don't think is true. The same as the 12. Peter, the 12 who Jesus chose and called them apostles. Why is that? Because Paul uses the term apostles differently to the way that the Gospels and Acts use the term apostles. Not completely differently, but quite differently. So the Gospels and Acts, when they use the word apostle, they tend to be talking about the 12, the foundational community leaders, the rock on which Jesus will build his church. We've got Peter, we've got the other 12. There's something there. They're like the rulers of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's kind of the apostles. Whereas with Paul, he doesn't call those 12 the apostles. He actually doesn't do it. He calls them the 12. So in Romans chapter 15, he actually says that the risen Christ appeared to Cephas, he's one of the 12, then to the 12, okay, so he's talking about the 12 there. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, so then there's other witnesses of the resurrection, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. Okay, now James was a defined community leader in Jerusalem, but he wasn't among the 12. Then to all the apostles. Okay, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 to 8. And last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So Paul counts himself as an apostle among that group, although he's different to them because Jesus appeared to him after his ascension and for various reasons. So he's not the same as the 12, and the apostles aren't the same as the 12. So I think the most likely option is for who the apostles are, is the same kind of usage that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 to 8. That is, foundational eyewitness missionaries. That is, people who saw Jesus rise from the dead and who were sent to Jesus to speak that message. Jesus has risen from the dead. So they're missionaries, but they're not just any missionaries. They're witnesses to Jesus rising from the dead. And that's what they say. That's what they testify to and we see that in Paul's own usage. That's who the apostles are. So they're not necessarily defined community leaders, but they are people who have an authority. Now, what is it? The authority? It's not like they're leading communities, but what they're doing is they're testifying. Now, the idea that they're foundational eyewitness missionaries just really does fit in with Paul's other descriptions of Andronicus and Junia that reinforce their status as foundational eyewitness missionaries. What does Paul say? They're Jews, my kinsfolk. He says, my fellow prisoners, they were willing to suffer for their mission and the testimony to the risen Christ. He says, they came to be in Christ before me. Well, they would have seen Jesus risen from the dead, and Jesus would have commissioned them before he commissioned Paul, after Jesus had ascended. And Junia as a woman, well, eyewitnesses to the resurrection, who were some of the most prominent and first eyewitnesses to the resurrection, who were given the task of passing on that oral tradition, testifying. They were sharing what they had seen. They were speaking to what they had seen. Well, that is, the earliest witnesses to the resurrection were women. We see that in the Gospels. And Junia is one of them. So Junia, well, she had an authority, but it's not the kind of, the text doesn't address that, so this is a little bit of speculation in one sense. But if you think about it, that's true. She has an authority, but it's the authority of testimony. It's the authority of saying, this is what I saw. And that's why plurality is important, because when you've got a witness to something that they saw, the more witnesses you've got, the more authority they carry. The testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses is stronger than the testimony of 1 witness. And that's why the testimony of witnesses to the resurrection is plural. Doesn't mean she's, some kind of apostle with a settled community leadership. So different to 12, Peter, James, and she's doing that alongside Andronicus as well. So maybe she was Andronicus's wife, maybe they were brother and sister, maybe they had some other partnership, probably most likely wife, but we can't be sure. But in any case, what matters is not individual authority, but missionary partnership and honour. That's what's going on. So what does Romans 16 do for us? What would we do if we preach on it or teach on it? Well, what Romans 16 does is it enhances the importance of missionary partnership. Team mission and ministry is really important because the gospel of God's grace brings that about. And let me just say, that's why I'm so glad for my colleague, soon to be not colleague, but ongoing sister in Christ and partner in ministry, Jane Tooher, who has been greatly involved in strengthening that ministry and mission partnership. That's been a great deal of what she's been doing over this time with the Priscilla and Aquila Centre and others. It enhances also the importance of honouring those who the world doesn't necessarily honour. So Romans 16 tells us that. The gospel of God's grace critiques and transforms human understandings of honour. Really important to speak on, to preach on, because otherwise we just use the world's categories of honour, our own world's categories of honour to honour people. And both of those things are actually quite important for thinking about complementarian ministry, for example, which is what Jane has been involved in particular, as have I, as I've taught alongside Jane in those areas. And both are really important to preach. So don't neglect Romans chapter 16. Here's some further implications. Let's just remember the value of actively honouring fellow missionaries, team members, if you're involved in Christian ministry. How do we specifically honour people? Because as Aussies, we're very much we're very much affected by the tall poppy syndrome. We don't want to honour people. We think it's a bad thing to do. We do need to honour people, but not just honouring the great ones, not just looking at the people who we think, oh, they're the great ones, so we honour them. No, honour those who labour and toil, servants. Praise that. And we need to honour people, women, others, various people who are not necessarily going to be honoured as much as they are in our, or seem to be in our society. So doing that deliberately, as I think we learn that from Romans chapter 16. Now, we might want to ask questions like, well, what were the precise roles of these women who were involved in ministry? And actually, Romans 16 doesn't answer that directly. Paul doesn't answer them in Romans 16. I think, and this is what Chrysostom does, and I think others, this makes sense, that we have other parts of the Bible for that. So you look at other parts of the Bible and you see a little bit more what some of those roles are. 1 Timothy 2, other places. But that's not the point that Paul's making. He's not talking about roles. He's not really talking about community authority. He's talking about missionary and ministry partnership, and that's what really matters. So I also want to say, what we could even do sometimes is to try to think about a historical background and apply that. But actually, I think we can learn so much more from Romans, not just by trying to find what was going on behind the text and come up with these major historical reconstructions and write some historical fiction and try to, write that and say, oh, that's how we apply it. I think we apply it by looking at how does Romans and what Paul's actually doing, what we know he's doing, fit into the overall argument of Romans. That's exactly what Paul was trying to achieve. How can we apply this? And so I do want to do that. I want to honour Jane. I want to honour others who have worked hard, who have done wonderful work for the gospel, which is very often behind the scenes and not seen, but is incredible. And I want to say, if you want to see some of the amazing things that Jane has done, go to the Priscilla and Aquila Centre website, pao.more.edu.au. Look at the resources section, and in that resources section, there is so much there, and that's been some of that Jane has been directly involved in, and other things that she has just put together some incredible resources. But I hope that's been helpful for you to think more about how do you preach Romans 16, how do you teach Romans 16 in Bible studies, whatever it is, and how do you actually take that and not just neglect it and say, oh, that's just a list of names, far more than a list of names.